Subscribe before we start, and make one guess in the comments. What do you think is beyond the line those dogs refuse to cross? Keep your answer until the end. The doe turned around and ran back into the dogs. I watched it happen through my binoculars from the bed of my truck, maybe 200 yards off. 19 years a game warden at that point, and I'd never seen anything like it. And I have not seen anything like it since. She was running clean and hard down an old skid road with 2 hounds behind her. And then she planted all 4 feet, spun, and went straight back up the road into them. Went right between them. One of the dogs got a mouthful of hide off her flank, and she never slowed. Then the dogs stopped too. Not at the deer, not at me. They stopped about 40 feet short of a spot on that skid road where there was nothing at all, no fence, no water, no cut, just more pine litter and more shade, and they stood there with their noses up and their tails down and would not go another step. Then they came back the way they'd come, at a trot, like the hunt was over and somebody had told them so. Here's the thing I didn't put together until about a week later. That doe turned around about 20 yards further down that road than where the dogs quit. She got closer to it than they would. She had 2 hounds on her, and one of them had already opened her flank. And she looked at whatever was in front of her. And she looked back at the dogs. And she picked the dogs. 19 years. And I had never once had an animal tell me something I couldn't find. 10 minutes later, I had both of those dogs in the cage in my truck bed and a phone number off a collar plate. And by supper, I had a citation written on a man out of Shelby County who'd been letting his hounds run deer on private timberland for 2 seasons. That's the part of the job that pays. But the reason I'm telling you any of this is that the piece of ground those dogs wouldn't cross sits inside a block of company timber that the state had opened to public hunting. And the youth hunt on it opened in 24 days. That block runs under a managed lands permit, which for anybody who doesn't hunt means the trust does its own survey work and files a harvest plan. And in exchange, it gets a season that opens the Saturday nearest the end of September, better than a month ahead of the general season. So this was going to happen in heat. That's not a detail. Hold on to it. 16 kids drawn by lottery, adult supervisor apiece. Camp on a food plot about a half-mile from the spot where a deer decided 2 dogs were a better bet than whatever was in front of her. I was the only warden in Pardee County. That's 40-some-odd thousand acres of Ostrander Timber Trust alone. The Bethel Block, running east off the county road down toward the Sabine Bottoms. Loblolly pine on the high ground in blocks by age class, and hardwood in the low ground where it stays too wet to plant. I've worked that block since I made it out of the academy. I know where the club members park. I know which gates get their chains cut every October. And I know which Slavs will suck a 4-wheeler down to the axle. I could have told you the name of every drainage in there. I could not have told you why a hound wouldn't work the west end of Latham Bottom. So I took the collar. Both dogs had them, the kind with GPS in the housing that talks to a handheld unit, so a man can sit on a tailgate and watch his dogs work on a screen. They keep a track log, breadcrumbs, every few seconds, going back weeks if nobody's cleared it. I kept one collar as evidence and gave the man back his other one and his dogs. And I did not tell him why I only wanted the one. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a collar, a borrowed handheld, and my laptop. And I pulled the log off it. Terry came in behind me around 9 with her cane in her left hand and looked over my shoulder at the screen. She was a school nurse for 22 years before her hands quit cooperating. And she has never once pretended not to be interested in my work just because it's mine. That's not a map, she said. That's a doodle. It did look like one. Weeks of 2 dogs working 40,000 acres draws something like steel wool loops on loops. Thick where they'd hunted hard, thin where they'd traveled. It goes down over the roads and the creeks and the bedding thickets. And after a while, you can read it about as well as you can read a topo. And in the middle of the west end of Latham Bottom, there was a hole in it. Not a thin place, a hole, maybe 300 acres, roughly oval, running with the bottom. And the scribble came right up against it and turned, over and over. You could see individual runs where a dog had come down a slough headed east at a good clip. And then the line broke hard, left or hard right, and ran along the edge like it was following a wall. In places, the track paralleled that edge for a quarter mile, without deviating 20 feet. Terry sat down. She's careful about sitting down now, so it takes her a second, and she used the second to keep looking at the screen. Wait, that's a straight line. It's not straight. It's a curve. But it's a clean one. Dogs don't do clean. They don't. That's the whole thing. A dog will go anywhere smell goes. I have pulled hounds out of culverts and off of bluffs, and one out of a hog trap he'd let himself into. Whatever it is that makes a dog quit bees, a fence, a bad memory, a big male cat holding a territory, it doesn't quit them at a line you could survey. I tried the easy answers first, because that's the job, and because I wanted one. Chemicals were my first thought. Industrial timber gets sprayed. Herbicide mostly on the young plantations, to knock back the hardwood competition, and it's all permitted and all on file. I spent most of the next morning on the phone and in the state's records, and there was nothing on that ground. Latham Bottom is hardwood in a wet draw. You don't spray it, you don't plant it. You leave it because it makes better duck water than it makes lumber. And even if somebody had dumped something in there back when nobody was watching, that's not how animals behave around poison. They cross it. They drink out of it. That's the tragedy of poison. It doesn't warn anybody. Bees I ruled out because bees are seasonal and the log wasn't. A hog trap or a bait pen wouldn't turn a dog a quarter mile out. A cookhouse or a camp with dogs of its own would have made noise in the log, and it would have made noise in the county. And I'd have heard about it from 3 people at the feed store before I heard it anywhere else. A cat's territory has a shape, but it has a soft shape, and it moves. I did think about the ground itself. There's slough in there that'll take a dog's feet out from under him. But the void wasn't all low. The north side of it climbed up onto a little sand ridge with big loblolly on it, dry as a church floor. And the dogs wouldn't touch that either. By the 3rd day, I'd stopped looking for the reason and started looking for a second opinion. There's a man in the north end of the county who runs hogs with dogs, legally, on a permit, and who has never once given me any trouble beyond an expired trailer tag. I asked him if I could look at his handheld. He asked why, and I said because I'm nosy. And he said that tracks, and he handed it over. His pack had worked the Bethel block 2 seasons back, before the trust tightened up the hog leases. Different dogs, different owner, different year, different game entirely. Hogs, not deer. And a hog will take a dog into water a deer wouldn't consider. I pulled the log in my truck in his driveway with the engine running and the AC on my face. It's the only time in this whole business that I felt something go cold in me before I understood anything. Because the shape came up on that little screen the same as it had on my laptop. Not close, the same. His dogs had run the same wall from the other side in a different season and turned off of it at the same place. My 2 hounds had turned off of it, within what looked to me like the width of a county road. I sat there until he came out and knocked on my window to see if I was all right. I told him I was fine and that his tags were still expired. Then I drove home the long way, past the main gate of the Bethel block, where somebody from the trust had already zip-tied a laminated sign to the cattle guard with a state logo on it, and the dates of the youth hunt printed big enough to read from the road. I took Jesse with me because the walk needed 2 people, and because he'd asked to see something besides boat ramps. Jesse Renfro was 24 and 4 months out of the academy, doing his field training under me, which in a one-warden county means he did whatever I did and heard whatever I said about it. Good kid. Big through the shoulders, quick on paperwork. The kind of new officer who says, "Yes, sir," to a man who's told him twice not to. He had a way of standing with his hands on his belt like he'd seen somebody do it on television, and he was slowly growing out of it. We parked at the pipeline right-of-way on the west side and walked in a little before 8, and it was already close to 90. East Texas in early September doesn't have air. It has broth. Cicadas going in every tree loud enough that you have to raise your voice, and the deer flies finding the back of your neck, and that particular smell of the bottom's mud and rot and something sweet in it, like a fruit stand at the end of the day. I had the void plotted on my phone off the 2-color logs. I'd drawn it as best I could, and it was rough, but the edge was good enough to walk to. We came down off the sand ridge into the hardwood, stepping over blowdown, and I was watching my phone more than my feet and thinking about how I was going to write any of this up. When Jesse said, "Sir," I looked at him. He had his head cocked. Then I heard it, which is the wrong word, because what I heard was nothing. The cicadas had quit, not faded, quit, like a hand had come down on a radio dial. I turned around and looked back the way we'd come, and they were still going strong up on the ridge behind us, that hard, dry ringing. And it stopped in a line I could have walked along with a can of paint. I took 2 steps back the way I'd come, and it came up around me again, full volume, and I took 2 steps forward, and it was gone. We stood there and did that 4 or 5 times, like a couple of fools, stepping in and out of it. "Is it the wind?" Jesse said. He said it quiet. There wasn't any wind. That was the other thing, not still like a calm morning is still, where the leaves hang and something moves once in a while. Still like the inside of a closed room in a vacant house. The air in there had a temperature and no motion at all, and it was thicker than the air behind us, or it felt thicker. And I've thought since that it only felt that way because the sound was gone, and my body didn't have anything else to blame. We went in maybe 150 yards. I want to be careful about how I say this next part, because I've had 9 years to make it sound better than it was, and I'd rather it stayed accurate. Nothing came at us. Nothing moved. It was a piece of bottomland hardwood in the summer, with tupelo and water oak and a little standing water in the low spots the color of coffee with milk in it. It was shaded. It was cooler than the ridge by a good bit. It was, I'd say, the most comfortable place. I had been outdoors in 3 months, and there were no mosquitoes. I'd been swatting them off my wrists all the way down out of the pines, and I stopped. And after a minute, I noticed I'd stopped. And I held my arm out in front of me in the middle of a Sabine River bottom in September and watched nothing land on it. No mosquitoes, no deer flies, no gnats in my eyes, no dragonflies working the water, no frogs. I stood at the edge of one of those little sloughs, and there wasn't a skater on it or a ripple in it, and the surface had dust on it, real dust, like a table nobody wipes. Jesse had gone quiet in a way I didn't like. I told him we were going out. Here's the part that embarrassed me. I turned us around and walked, and after 2 or 3 minutes, the ground was still going down instead of up. And I checked my phone, and we were headed nearly due south. I'd have sworn on a Bible we were walking back the way we came. There's no compass fault in there, before you ask. My phone worked, my handheld worked. The little map was where it should have been. I just had gotten turned around in 150 yards of open woods, in daylight, on ground I'd hunted, and I hadn't felt it happen. It didn't feel like being lost. It felt like being right. We corrected and came out about 200 yards north of where we went in. And the sound came back on like a switch, and the heat came down on us, and a mosquito got me on the ear inside of 10 seconds. And I have never in my life been so glad to be bitten. Jesse sat down on a log and drank most of a bottle of water and didn't say anything for a while. "You feel that?" he finally said, about halfway in. "Feel what?" I wanted to sit down. He looked at his boots, not like tired, like at Thanksgiving, when you've eaten and somebody's got a game on, and you sit in a chair you weren't planning to sit in. He laughed a little at himself. That, in the woods, at 8:30 in the morning. I told him it was the heat and the humidity, and that he needed to drink more, and he said, "Yes, sir." But I'd felt it too. I'd felt it standing at that slough with my arm out, not sleepy, comfortable, 150 yards inside the only patch of shade in Pardee County that didn't have a bug in it, on the one piece of ground where no animal alive would follow me. That was Tuesday. On Wednesday, I called Ostrander. The trust keeps a land office in a converted house in town, and the person you talk to is Beth Ann Ostrander, who is 63 and whose grandfather's name is on the deed. The family sold the whole works to an investment trust years back, and the trust kept her on as a consultant, which is what you do when you buy 40,000 acres and don't know where the gates are. I've known Beth Ann my whole career. She sends a ham to the game warden every Christmas. She is unfailingly polite, and she is the most careful talker I have ever met in my life. I told her I had a question about the Bethel block, and she said, of course. I told her I was looking at some acreage in the west end of Latham Bottom, in relation to the youth hunt, and asked whether the trust had any history on it, spray, dumping, an old mill site, anything at all. The pause was about 2 seconds long. 2 seconds is nothing in conversation, unless you've spent 19 years listening to people decide how much to tell you. I don't have anything showing an issue on acreage that isn't in question, she said. Now, that's a good sentence. I've thought about that sentence a lot. It isn't a lie. It doesn't say there's no history. It says her file doesn't show a problem on ground nobody's raised a problem out, which puts the burden right back across the table onto me, gently, without any fingerprints on it. I'm raising it, I said. Are you writing something? I don't know yet. Well, another pause, shorter. Wade, that hunt's got a lot of eyes on it. It's the second year of the cooperative agreement, and there's people in Austin who'd like it to go well. I said I'd like it to go well too. She said she was sure I would, and asked after Terry by name, and told me to call her if I needed a gate combination, and got off the phone. She never said the word Latham, not once. I'd said it. She'd said acreage. Thursday, I went back in alone, which I'll admit wasn't smart, and I found the bed. It was up on the dry side, on that sand ridge where the big pines are. Hard pan up there, packed sandy clay with pine straw over it, the kind of ground where my boot heel leaves a scuff and not much else. Deer bed on it all the time. A normal bed on that ground is a scrape and a flattening. An inch of disturbance, maybe 2 if the deer worked it. This one was 7 inches deep. I measured it twice with the tape off my belt, because the first number didn't seem like a number. 7 inches down into hardpan, roughly the shape of a deer lying on its side with the legs tucked, and the edges of it were sharp. That's what got me. not the depth the edges. When something heavy sinks into ground, the ground pushes up and out, and the rim goes soft and crumbly. These edges stood up clean, like the impression had been cut with a knife and then fired. And the surface inside had a sheen on it. I put my thumbnail against the wall of it, and it didn't crumble. It clicked. A doe will go 120, maybe 130 pounds around here. There is no arrangement of 130 pounds that puts a deer 7 inches into hardpan, while 190 pounds of game warden standing right next to it barely marks the straw. I found the tracks coming in from the north at a walk, unhurried, in the softer duff at the edge of the pines. 4 sets of prints in a normal walking pattern up to the bed. I circled that bed at 5 yards, then 10, then 20, and there were no tracks leaving it. There was no drag, no wallow trail, no scuff, no hair, no fluid, no flies. Nothing had eaten there. Nothing had dragged anything off. Around here, a dead deer is a neighborhood event. Coyotes, hogs, buzzards inside a day. This was clean woods, with a hole in it in the shape of an animal that walked in and did not walk out. And I want to say the thing about those tracks that I could never get anybody to hear afterward, including a captain I respect. They were at a walk. Everything I had up to that morning said no animal would go in there. A doe took 2 hounds over it rather than take one more step. A pack of hog dogs turned off it in 2 different seasons, 2 different owners, 2 different years. And here was a deer that had come down off the north side at a walk. 4 clean sets, even spacing, no skid, no stumble, nothing hurrying, the way a deer moves through country it has no complaint about. So they don't all refuse. Most of them refuse. And whatever gets the ones that don't, it doesn't chase them in. It gets them to come in on their own and lie down. I sat on my heels next to it for a long time. Then I went to the truck and got the box I carry for tire impressions and hoof casts and poaching cases. And I mixed dental stone in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket with water out of my jug, 3 batches of it, pouring as I went. And I poured that bed like it was evidence in a case I already had a suspect for. It set up in about 20 minutes. When I lifted it out, it came clean. And it was the best cast I have ever taken in my career. Every hair. You could see individual hairs pressed into the wall of it, and the little flattened whorl where the shoulder had been. It weighed a good 30 pounds, and I carried it out cradled against my chest like a sack of feed. And my right shoulder, which has been going since I hauled a boat motor by myself in 2019, and which I had been babying for 6 years, let me know about it the whole quarter mile. I put it in the back of the truck under a moving blanket. Then I sat in the cab with the AC running and my hands on the wheel, and made a decision that cost me everything it eventually cost me. I opened a hazard file. There's a form for it. Officers use it for washed-out low-water crossings, unstable bluffs, a dumped drum of something, a bridge that won't hold a truck. It goes to the district captain, and it becomes a record with a date on it, and once it exists, you can't unknow what's in it, and neither can anybody above you. I typed in the coordinates and the acreage estimate. Under description, I typed approximately 300 acres, West End Latham Bottom, anomalous conditions, sea attachments. Then I sat there in a hot truck and tried for 10 minutes to write a sentence that would make a captain in Lufkin do anything at all. And everything I typed sounded like a man who'd been in the sun too long. I saved it as a draft. Didn't send it. Because I knew what he'd ask. He'd ask what the mechanism was. What is it, Wade? Is it gas? Is it a sinkhole? Is it a chemical? Is it a bear? Give me the noun. And I had a hole in a dog track, a piece of quiet, a bed cast in plaster, and 16 days. Verna Pruitt has run a bait stand on the county road going on 40 years, and she still sells minnows out of a green tank with a hand net hanging off it. I stopped there Friday morning because I wanted a Coke and because Verna knows more about that end of the county than the county does. She's in her 80s now. She sits on a stool behind the register with a box fan aimed at her and a fly swatter across her knees like a scepter. I bought the Coke and asked her, easy as I could make it, whether she'd ever heard anything about the west end of Latham Bottom. She didn't answer for a second. Then she set the swatter down. "Nobody sleeps in Latham Bottom," she said. I said I didn't follow. "That's the whole thing. That's all of it. My daddy told me and his daddy told him. You can walk it, you can hunt it, you can wade it. You don't lay down in it, and you don't drink in it, and you don't take a nap in it." She looked at me. "You already been in there." I said I had. "Well, you come out." She picked the swatter back up and turned it over in her hands. "You want the names or you want the Coke?" I said I wanted the names. There were 4 she'd give me with any confidence. A man named Tulos, back before she was born, who went in there with a jug and never came out, and whose brother found his hat. A boy in 1988. She gave me his first name and said his people had moved to Longview, who was squirrel hunting with 2 cousins and got hot and sat down against a tree. And the cousins came back for him inside of a half hour and had to slap his face and get him up and walking. And he was strange for a week and fine after that. A man named Skeet Donahue in the 90s, who was drinking, and who his brother-in-law went in after and found about an hour later, and who did not come out. And Dwight. She said the last name flat. Dwight Pruitt. Her son. I already knew that one. I wrote the report on it in 2016. Dwight was 44, diabetic, drank some, worked offshore in his younger years, and did odd jobs after. He went into the Bethel block in July after a hog and never came home. We had 30-some people on it for 4 days. Dogs, a helicopter out of Tyler on the 2nd day. We found his 4-wheeler on a skid road with a key in it and half a tank of gas. We never found him. I signed the report. I put it in as a probable drowning in the Sabine Bottoms, undetermined. And I sat in Verna's living room and told her that's what I believed had happened. And she said thank you for looking. And she has bought me a Coke every time I've come in that store since. "You wrote he drowned," she said. I did. There ain't but 8 inches of water in there in July. I know it. I know you know it. She said that without any heat at all, which was worse. You was doing your job. I drove to the district office in Lufkin that afternoon and pulled the file. That's an hour and a half each way, and I did not have the time, and I went anyway. The 2016 case file is in a banker's box in a room with a dehumidifier in it, because everything in this part of the country is either wet or on its way. I found the box, and I sat on the floor with it, and I read my own handwriting from 9 years back. Page 4. Search Day 2. Sector Notes. The sand ridge on the north end of Latham Bottom. My own printing. Blue ink. Depression in mud. 6 feet possible wallow. No sign. That's it. That's the whole entry. No photograph. No measurement. I'd had a camera on my belt and a tape in my pocket. And I'd walked up on a 6-foot depression in the ground on day 2 of a search for a missing man. And I had written 9 words about it and moved on, because we were burning daylight and I had a helicopter coming. And 30 volunteers to keep out of the water, and I already had a theory that fit. I want to be plain about this, since I've had a long time to be less than plain about it. I didn't miss it. I saw it. I looked at it and decided what it was, and wrote the decision down. And the decision was wrong. And Verna Pruitt has been bringing flowers to a stone with nothing under it for 9 years. I made a copy of page 4 and drove home and did not tell Terry for 2 days. When I did it badly. I came in and put the copy on the table and said there was something I should have caught in 2016. And she read the 9 words twice and then asked me for the names. So I gave her the list. Tullos, the boy from 1988. Skeet Donahue, Dwight. And the deer. Terry was a school nurse for 22 years. Before that, she did 3 years in a nursing home. She has a way of listening where she asks you for something small and specific in the middle of your story. And you answer it, and then you find out she was building something the whole time. The boy in 1988, she said. The cousins had to slap him. That's what she said. And your man Skeet was drinking, and Tullos had a jug. She tapped the copy with 2 fingers. And Dwight was diabetic, and he'd been out in July heat since daylight. I said, all right. Wait, honey, those aren't 4 different things. She sat back. That's one thing 4 times. Every single one of them was asleep or on his way to it. I didn't say anything for a minute. A deer beds down, she said. That's what bedding is. And that boy in 1988 sat down against a tree and they got to him in a half hour and woke him up and he lived. And they got to your Skeet Donahue in an hour and they didn't. Half hour lives, I said. Hour doesn't. That's 2 people. That's not a study. She was already frustrated with herself for saying it out loud, because she's careful with numbers in a way I'm not. But it's the only 2 you've got. I've been asked since how I settled on 40 minutes. And the honest answer is that a retired school nurse and I split the difference between one boy who lived and one man who didn't at my kitchen table over the top of a photocopy. That's the whole science of it. I've never had a better number, and I've never needed one. And I have thought more than once about how much of what I did the following week was built on a guess made in a kitchen in a 100-year-old house with a window unit rattling in the frame. The last thing Terry said that night, she said with her hand flat on the table, you can't fence sleep. That's the part that broke my back on the whole idea. I had spent 4 days thinking about a fence. Because a fence is what you build around a hazard. And a fence is a thing a captain understands. But the hazard wasn't the ground. A man can walk that ground all day. A man can wade it and hunt it and cross it and walk out and eat supper. The hazard was a condition inside a man's own body, on ground that was cooler and quieter and more comfortable than anywhere else, within 20 miles, on a piece of a hunt map in September, with 16 children and 16 adults who were going to get hot and tired and want to sit down. The next morning, I went back in and found the second one. And that changed everything I intended to do. It was down off the ridge in the wet. And I found it because a hog trail crossed the slough there, and I was following the trail to see where it turned. Hog sign is everywhere in the Bethel block. Rooting, wallows, rubs on the Tupelo trunks. But this was in the mud on the near bank, and it wasn't a wallow. It was an impression, the same as the bed on the ridge, in the rough shape of an animal lying down on a hog. From the size of it, a decent one, maybe 150 pounds. Same knifed edges, same sheen on the surface of it, maybe 4 inches deep, which in soft creek mud shouldn't have held a shape at all. And it had held it well enough that I could see the crease where a shoulder had been. But it was open at one end. The rim on the far side was broken and dragged, mud smeared up out of it and over the bank in a mess, the way ground looks when something scrambles. And going away from that broken rim, up the bank and off into the palmetto, were hog tracks, deep, splayed, running, one foot on top of another, where the animal had gotten its feet crossed, getting up. Something had laid down in there. The ground had started on it, and then it had gotten up and left. I squatted at the edge of that thing with my forearms on my knees and worked through it the way you work through a scene where you don't have a witness. The tracks going in were at a walk from the water. The impression was formed, but not finished. The rim was breached from the inside. The tracks going out were at a dead run. Something woke it up. I don't know what. A hog is a hog. Another hog came through, or a coyote crossed downwind, or its own leg went to sleep. Doesn't matter. What mattered, what I sat there in the mud and understood. And what made every choice I made afterward possible was that the process was not instantaneous, and it was not final. It had a middle. And in the middle, if something got that animal up on its feet, the animal walked out of the woods and went on being a hog. I took a picture of it. Then I took a picture of the tracks. Then I put my phone away and did something I'd been avoiding for a week, which was to think about what I was going to do with it. Because now I couldn't hand this to anybody as a curiosity anymore. If the thing had a middle, then somebody who got there in time could pull a person out of it. And there wasn't going to be anybody standing there in time. Not with 16 kids spread over a mile of bottom, and a base camp a half-mile west, and radios that. And this was the thought that put a cold spot in the middle of a 94-degree morning, because I'd been in that quiet twice now. And it had not once occurred to me to test at radios that I'd never actually keyed up inside that line. I had walked in there twice with a portable on my chest and never pushed the button. I hiked back to the truck, and I got the dental stone box out of the bed. And then I stood there with the tailgate down and thought about it and put the box back. I didn't need another cast. A cast wasn't going to move a captain. I had a 30-pound plaster deer under a blanket in my garage that proved nothing to anybody who hadn't stood on that ridge. What I needed was a witness and a test. I called Jesse from the pipeline right-of-way where I had one bar, and I told him to bring a roll of survey tape and a box of earplugs and to be at the gate at 7 in the morning. He said, "Yes, sir." Then he said, "What are we doing?" "Finding out if anybody in there can hear us," I said. We hung tape first, because I wanted the line on the ground where a man could see it. I had the void plotted off the 2 collar logs, and I'd walked the west edge twice, so we started where I was surest and worked north. It's slow work. You go until the cicadas quit, back up until they come on, split the difference, and tie a strip of orange tape at chest height on whatever's handy. We did that for 2 hours and put up better than 40 flags over a half-mile. And by the time we quit, you could stand at 1 flag and see 2 more. Jesse got quiet doing it. He'd walk up to a flag, put a hand on the trunk, lean his head an inch or 2 past it, and pull back. Doing it without knowing he was, the way a man tests a stove eye. "It's not the thicket," he said. "I keep wanting it to be a thicket blocking the sound. It's the same trees on both sides." It was the same trees. Same water oak, same tupelo, same palmetto, same coffee-colored water. That was the thing I'd been chewing on for a week and couldn't get anybody to care about over a phone. Then we ran the test. I put Jesse at a flag, with his hand on the trunk, and told him not to move off it for any reason. And I walked in 60 yards on a compass bearing and stopped where I could still see the orange through the trunks. 60 yards in bottomland hardwood, with a man in a gray uniform shirt standing in filtered sun, is nothing. I could see the shape of him. I could see him lift his hand. I keyed my portable first. "Renfro, radio check." Nothing came back. Not static, not a squelch break. The little display said it was transmitting. I tried twice more, then set the radio on a log and blew my whistle. The plastic one on the zipper pull of my vest, the kind that'll bring your dog in from 400 yards. I blew it until my ears rang. And I want to be exact here. I heard it. It was loud. It sounded thin, the way a whistle sounds inside a car with the windows up. But it was there. Jesse never turned his head. So I did the last thing. I had told him in the truck that I might, and I had made him repeat back to me that if he heard a shot, he was to stay put and not come in. And he'd said yes, sir, with a look on his face that told me he thought I'd lost hold of something. I drew my duty weapon, checked my background at a mud bank. No water past it, nothing beyond for 300 yards, pointed it down at a .45, and fired one round into the dirt. The report was flat. That's the only way I know to say it. It went off and it stopped. There was no crack rolling off through the timber, no slap coming back off the far bank of the slough. It sounded the way a firecracker sounds in a garage with the door shut and a load of quilts in the corner. My ears rang, and the ringing was inside my own head, and there was nothing outside it at all. Not a bird got up. Understand what I'm telling you. I have shot 100 deer in these woods, and every single time, something flies. Wood ducks come off the water, herons, jays, doves. Nothing moved anywhere in front of me, because there was nothing in there to move. And here's the part I worked on for years afterward, and never got anywhere with. Sound goes in. I stood in there the first time with Jesse and heard the cicadas ringing on the ridge behind us, plain as a truck radio through a window. Walking out, I heard them before I ever reached the line. It isn't a wall. It lets things through. It just doesn't let anything back. You can hear the world from in there. The world cannot hear you. 19 years, and I have never once thought of a natural process that runs one direction, and I quit trying a long time ago. And I'd be lying if I told you the reason I quit was that I ran out of ideas. I walked out. Jesse was standing exactly where I'd left him with his hand on the trunk. When he saw me, he took his hand down. "You didn't do it," he said. "You said you were going to." "I did it." He looked at me for a long second. Then he walked to the flag line, put one boot across it, and stopped with his other foot behind. "Do it again. Once was enough." "Sir, I've got the round count in my log, and you've got a body on the other side of that tape who heard nothing," I said. "That's what I needed. I'm not shooting a hole in this county for your peace of mind." He didn't say anything on the walk back to the trucks. When we got there, he sat on his tailgate and drank a bottle of water and then another one and ate a granola bar out of his console. And he was breathing like a man who'd carried something. I noticed it, and I attributed it to the heat and to being 24, and having just found out that the world has a room in it with the sound turned off. I have gone back over that afternoon more times than I can count. That evening I wrote the hazard memo. Took me 3 hours. I finished the description field I'd left as a draft, and I put in the collar logs from 2 owners and 2 seasons, and photographs of the deer bed and the hog impression with a tape-in frame. And the cast, I photographed it on my workbench with a ruler beside it, and the failed radio check with times and unit numbers, and 1 sentence about the discharged round with a witnessing officer's name. That round bought me a discharge report and a phone call from a lieutenant in Austin. And it was the cheapest thing I paid for that whole month. Then I typed the recommendation, which was the only part that mattered. Temporary closure of approximately 300 acres, West End, Latham Bottom, and relocation of the youth hunt camp and stands east of Persimmon Road. I did not write down what I actually thought was happening in there. Not one word of it. I want that on the record, because it's the beginning of the compromise I ended up making. 11 days. I hit send at 20 to 12 at night and then sat in that kitchen with the laptop closed and did the one thing I'd been putting off for 2 weeks, which was to read the permit list for that hunt. It's a public document. 16 names, 16 ages, 16 towns. The youngest was 9 years old. 2 of them were out of Pardee County, and one of the last names I knew well enough to put a face on a man I stood behind in line at the feed store. I'd been saying 16 kids for 2 weeks because 16 kids is a number, and a number is something you can put in a memo. The captain called me at 10 the next morning from Lufkin. He's a decent man. 26 years, came up in the Marine Division, keeps a picture of his daughter's rodeo team on his wall. He read every page. I could hear him clicking through the photographs while we talked. And he asked good questions, in the right order: spray records, mineral leases, gas wells, orphan wells, whether the Sand Ridge had ever been a dump. Then he got to the part he'd been working around. Wait, what is it? I don't know. I need a noun. That's not me being ugly with you. I've got to put a noun in an email to a director. He let that sit. Unstable ground I can do tomorrow. Gas seep I can call the Railroad Commission and have a man out there Thursday. Contamination, I've got a whole division. What's the noun? Something in there kills things that go to sleep in it. That's not a noun. That's a ghost story with a plaster deer attached to it. I've got 2 collar logs from 2. I read them. I believe them. I believe every page of this. He was quiet for a second. You want to hear my problem, or you want to argue? I told him to go ahead. That's not our land, he said. It's Ostrander's. We've got a cooperative access agreement on it, and 2 other blocks in Newton and Jasper. 30-some-odd thousand acres of private timber that the public can hunt for the price of a permit, and it's the 2nd year. And the agreement's got a clause in it that says if we impose restrictions on their property without a landowner request, they can walk. Their lawyer wrote that clause. He wrote it because he was worried about exactly this. So we lose a hunt. We lose 3 counties of public access for the next 10 years, and every hunt we've got scheduled on it. And I'll tell you what else. This came out of Austin. It's the model for 4 more of these agreements, and there's a deputy director whose name is on it. He sighed, and it wasn't a performance. I'm not telling you no. I'm telling you I can close ground on a landowner request in about 2 hours. Without one, I need a hazard with a noun on it, and I can't manufacture one, and neither can you. I asked him what he'd do. I'd go see Beth Ann Ostrander, he said. And I'd take the plaster deer. I didn't take the deer. I took the photographs and the collar logs and the ruler. And I sat in that converted house on Nacogdoches Street on the Monday morning with the hunt 5 days out. Beth Ann poured coffee neither of us drank. She has a way of holding a cup with both hands that means she's not going to be interrupted. I laid it all out: the 2 collar logs, the bed, the depth in hardpan, the impression that broke open and the tracks running out of it, the radio, the shot. I told her plainly that I had 9 words in my own handwriting from 2016 about a depression in the mud that I hadn't photographed, and whose son that was. She looked at the photograph of the deer bed for a long time, long enough that I quit talking. 7 inches, she said. In hardpan. My daddy was a forester before he was a landowner. She set the cup down. He used to say the only ground on this place that ever cost him money was ground that didn't do anything. Then she got up and went into the back room where they keep the flat files. And she was gone 6 or 7 minutes, and she came back with a sheet of linen paper about 2 feet across and laid it on the table and turned it around so it faced me. It was a hand-drawn lease map. 1974, lettered in her father's hand, back when the family leased to 4 or 5 deer clubs and drew the boundaries themselves in ink. Compartment numbers, roads, the creek system, camp locations marked with little squares. And in the west end of Latham Bottom, in pencil, not ink, pencil, the way a man marks something he's not sure how to explain, an oval. Freehand, gone over twice. Inside it, 2 words. No camp. That's all it said. No date, no reason, no initials. An oval about the size of a coffee can lit on a 2-foot map in a bottom that runs 300 acres. I put my photograph of the collar log next to it. I had my plotted void on the phone, and I held it up against her father's pencil. It wasn't a perfect match. His oval was fatter on the north end, and it didn't run as far east. But any surveyor in the world would have called it the same feature. Beth Ann sat down and put her fingers over her mouth. "It never made it in," she said. "Into what?" "When the trust bought us, they consolidated all the leases and had everything digitized. 1998. A firm out of Houston scanned the old maps and rebuilt the boundaries in the computer." She was talking to the table more than to me. "Roads came through, compartments came through, creeks came through, some of them wrong. Anything in ink came through." She touched the pencil oval with one finger and didn't press. "Nobody keys in a pencil mark that doesn't have a reason written on it. It's not a hazard, it's not a boundary, it's not an easement. It's a doodle." Somebody knew. Somebody knew in 1974 and didn't write it down. And then he died in 1991. She looked up. "And 2 years ago, I signed the acreage conversion that put Latham Bottom into the cooperative pool. I put my name on it. I ran the numbers off the computer map, same as anybody in this business would have. There it was. And I'll give her this, she said it out loud herself before I could. And she didn't cry about it, and she didn't reach for a lawyer. 'I can't close it,' she said. 'I don't have the authority, and I wouldn't get it in 5 days. What I can do is defer the acreage, pull those 300 acres out of this season's permitted area for wetland reasons, which is a form I fill out and file, and move the stands and the camp east of Persimmon. I can have that done by Wednesday.' I said that was all I'd come for. 'There's a condition.' She pulled a legal pad over. 'Counsel will want the deferred boundary walked and flagged and photographed on the ground before he'll sign anything that takes acreage out of a state agreement. On foot with a GPS track with a company representative present. He'll say it's so we can defend the acreage figure if the state asks. What it really is he wants a document with somebody's initials on it, because that's what lawyers want.' She wrote a date and turned the pad so I could see. 'The only day he'll have the paperwork ready, and the only day I can be in the field, is Friday.' Friday was the day before opening. I said yes. I want to be clear that nobody made me. I sat in an air-conditioned office with a cup of coffee I never touched. And I agreed to walk a 300-acre boundary on the hottest Friday of that September. One day before 16 kids came through the gate, because it was the only way the paper got signed. And because I'd already learned that year what happens when I decide a thing doesn't need documenting. Friday came in at 101 degrees with a heat advisory out for 11 counties. Beth Ann met us at the pipeline right-of-way at 7 in a company truck with a cooler in the bed. She wore boots and a long-sleeved fishing shirt, and she was not going 100 yards into that bottom. And she said so. And I told her she was the smartest one of us. Her job was the GPS unit and the camera and the log sheet at the trucks. Jesse and I split the boundary. I took the south half from the pipeline down to where the line bends at the beaver dam. He took the north half, up over the sand ridge and around the top of the oval and back. Roughly 1.25 miles apiece, flagging as we went, staying outside the tape outside, I said it twice and radio check every 15 minutes. He said, yes, sir. He had 2 liters of water on his belt and a shirt already dark down the back at 7 in the morning. I said, you eat this morning? Yes, sir. He'd tell me later that he had, and that it had been a granola bar in the truck at 6, and that he'd taken his insulin the night before like always, and hadn't thought a thing about it. Because he was 24, and he'd been managing it since he was 9, and he had never once let it be anybody's business at work. He didn't want to be the cadet who needed something. I knew he was diabetic. It's on the paperwork. I had never once looked at it as a fact about a man walking into hot woods. My half took me about 2 hours. I flagged, I photographed, I sweated through my vest, and I checked in at 15 and 30 and 45 in the hour. And he came back every time, a little shorter each time, but clear. At 9:45 he said, second flag past the ridge top, lines running true. At 10 o'clock he didn't answer. I called him 3 more times over the next 4 minutes and got nothing. Then I raised Beth Ann on the truck radio and asked if she had him. And she said no, and asked, in a voice that had gone very careful, whether that meant what she thought it meant. I'd finished my half an hour before, and I was back at the top of the ridge with a roll of tape in my hand, which is the one piece of luck in this entire story. I stood in 101 degrees with a radio in my hand and did the arithmetic I had built in my kitchen with my wife. 12 minutes. That's how long I let it go past the missed check-in, because a cadet can be a dead spot or a dropped mic or a man taking a leak with the volume knob bumped. And because once I stepped across that tape, nobody on God's earth could reach me either. 10:12. I looked at my watch when I made the call, and I have never had to look that time up since. At 12 minutes, I told Beth Ann to call the sheriff and start EMS toward the pipeline gate and to stay at the trucks, no matter what she saw or didn't see. Then I walked up the ridge to the second flag past the top and lifted the orange tape over my head and stepped under it. The quiet came down on me like a hand. I had been in it twice before, and it was worse going in fast. You lose the cicadas, and with them you lose the size of the woods. Everything went close. My own boots in the pine straw sounded like they were happening inside a truck cab, and my breathing was right up against my ears, and I remember being angry at how loud my vest was. I went north along the inside of the tape at a trot, checking the flags on my right, so I'd keep the line, calling his name with my voice and not the radio. I could hear myself, and I knew he couldn't. I did it anyway. A man does. I found him about 200 yards in, off the ridge on the wet side, where the sand runs out into the Tupelo. He was sitting with his back against a tree and his legs out in front of him, chin down on his chest, hat on the ground beside him. His portable was still clipped on his chest. One hand was open in the mud, palm up. He looked like every hunter I've ever come up on asleep in a stand. The mud was standing up around him. That's the picture I've got, and I'd trade it for a lot of other pictures. It wasn't a wallow, and it wasn't a sinking. The ground had come up around his hips and thighs in a rim, the same rim I'd photographed twice that month. Edges knifed clean and standing proud of the surface with that wet sheen on them. And it had closed to about the width of my hand on the outside of each leg. Behind him, the rim ran up the base of the Tupelo like caulk laid by somebody with a steady wrist. I got hold of his shoulders and shook him and yelled into his face and got nothing but his head rolling. His skin was wet and cool, where everything about that day should have been hot. That's what put me on it, cool skin at 101 degrees. I'd seen it once in a kid at a fish fry, and Terry had known it across a yard. I went into his vest pocket, and then his pants pockets, and in the right cargo pocket, there was a plastic tube of glucose gel, the kind you'd have to be looking for to find. I put my knee in the mud and got my thumb in the corner of his mouth and put the gel between his cheek and his gum and rubbed the outside of his cheek with my hand. And I talked at him the whole time in a voice nobody could hear. Then I poured water over his face and the back of his neck, most of a liter, and squeezed his ear hard enough to bruise it. I don't know how long. I have thought it was 2 minutes, and I have thought it was 7. Long enough that I looked down and saw the rim had come up over the tops of his thighs, and the mud on the outside of his right boot had closed over the welt of it. Then he coughed and turned his head and said something that wasn't a word. I got my left arm under his armpit and hauled, and the ground did not want him. That's the honest description. It wasn't suction, it wasn't grip, it was weight the way a wet fence post comes out. Giving an inch and taking it back, and I got him up onto his knees with my left arm, and my right hand came in to help, and my shoulder went. I've torn things before. This wasn't a tear so much as a giving way, a hot slack feeling low in the joint. And after that, my right arm was a thing I was carrying. So I did it left-handed. I got him standing with his weight on me, both of us in the mud past the ankle. And I turned him south and started walking. And every 15 or 20 feet he'd sag, and I'd get my hip under him and swear at him and get him going again. He was talking by then. None of it made sense. He said his sister's name twice, and he asked me about a truck. He kept trying to sit down. Twice he got most of the way down, and I held him up by his collar with one hand and told him he could sit down in Lufkin. The distance was 200 yards. It is the longest thing I have ever done. There is a point in that kind of work where you stop having a plan and just have the next step. And I remember at some point looking at the ground going by and thinking how cool it was in there, and how there wasn't a mosquito on either one of us, and how a man could set this boy down against a tree and rest for 1 minute, just the one, and finish it fresh. I want that in here, because I don't think you understand the place until you understand that it was still working on me while I was carrying him out of it. Then the orange came up through the trunks, and I got us 3 or 4 steps past it, and the world came back on. I mean that. Cicadas all at once. That hard, dry wall of sound out of every tree, and the heat, and a jay hollering, and the smell of hot pine. I put Jesse down in the straw on the outside of the tape, as in numb, and sat down beside him, and my hand started shaking and would not stop. And a mosquito lit on my wrist, and I watched it drink. 10:38 on my watch. He had checked in clear at 9:45. He had missed the 10 o'clock, so he went down somewhere inside those 15 minutes. And there is no way on this earth to narrow it, which means I had him across that tape somewhere between 38 minutes and 53 minutes after he sat down against that Tupelo. A retired school nurse and a game warden split the difference between one boy in 1988 and one man in the 90s and came up with 40 at a kitchen table over the top of a photocopy. So either the number was right, and I got him by nothing at all, or the number was wrong, and it never meant anything. I have carried both of those for 9 years. I have not been able to put either one down. Beth Ann had the sheriff's deputy and a county ambulance at the pipeline gate by the time I got him out to the right-of-way, which took another 20 minutes and most of what I had left. She'd done exactly what I told her. She was standing at the tailgate with the GPS unit still in her hand, and she never once asked me a question in front of the paramedics. They ran his sugar in the back of that ambulance, and I heard the number, and I'm not going to give it here, because it's his. It was low enough that the medic said something short and started a line without discussing it. They took him to Lufkin and kept him overnight, and he was fine. That's the plain outcome. Diabetic hypoglycemia, heat, exertion, missed food. Every bit of that is true, and every bit of it is in the incident report. and none of it explains the shape of the mud. Here's the thing I've had to sit with. Jesse doesn't remember it. He remembers the second flag past the ridge top. He remembers the line running true. After that, he has the inside of an ambulance and a hand on his arm. He's read my report, and he's read the medics, and he knows what I say I found. And he has never told me he doesn't believe me. What he does instead is worse. He'll say, "I know what you saw, sir," and change the subject to something about his truck. He put in for a transfer in the spring and got the coast, which is a good posting for a young officer. And we talk maybe 3 times a year now. He sent a card when I retired. He signed it with his rank. The trust deferred the acreage that Wednesday, before any of this. And after Friday, their council didn't fight anything at all. By the middle of October, the 300 acres came out of the cooperative pool permanently, filed as a wetland set aside. And by December, they had a 4-strand fence and gates and signs on the west and north sides, which came to a good deal of money, and which they spent in about 11 weeks. A fence was cheaper than the other thing. Beth Ann told me on the phone that nobody at the trust ever asked her a single question about why, and that this was the part she thought about at night. My memo is what went into the file. It cites unstable substrate and disorientation hazard. That's what it says. Both of those are true. A man does get turned around in there. And the ground does do something no soil map accounts for. And it is not the truth. And I wrote it that way on purpose, because I had learned by then exactly what happens to a document that has a ghost in it. And I wanted a closure that would survive me. It has. It's still closed. The lie in it is the load-bearing part, and I signed my name under it. The youth hunt went off the next morning, a half-mile east of Persimmon Road. 16 kids, 9 deer and 2 hogs, and a boy from Nacogdoches, who fell in a creek and got his picture in the county paper for it. Nobody knew. Nobody will. I had the shoulder done in November, a rotator cuff, and something else they told me about twice, and I still can't say right. Light duty until March. I hit 20 years that April, and 20 is the line where a spouse's coverage comes across with the pension. And I got there about 6 weeks before that shoulder would have made the decision for me. That was the arithmetic I'd been carrying underneath every other piece of arithmetic in this whole story, and I don't get to pretend otherwise. I was doing it in Beth Ann Ostrander's office, with a cup of coffee in front of me that I never touched. The last thing was Verna. I went by the bait stand in November before the fence went up, and she got me a Coke out of the box and wouldn't take the $1. I told her Dwight didn't drown. I told her I'd walked up on something in 2016 on day 2 and written 9 words about it and taken no photograph, and that I'd found the same thing twice back in September and put a cast of one on my workbench, and that I could not prove any part of it and never would, and that the ground where I believed her son was is behind a company fence now, with a sign on it. She listened to all of it with the box fan going. Then she said, "He liked to nap, always did. Since he was little, you couldn't keep him awake past noon." That's all. She picked her fly swatter back up and asked me how Terry was doing. And I told her, and I drank the Coke. Verna died 2 years ago, last March. I was at the funeral and there's still nothing under the stone. The cast is on the shelf over my workbench, wrapped in the moving blanket. It's 30 pounds of dental stone in the shape of a deer lying on its side, with the hairs still pressed into it. And I've had 4 people ask me what it is, and I've told 4 people it's a cast from an old poaching case. I drove out to the Bethel block in June, before the heat set in, because Beth Ann had asked me to look at the gates and because I wanted to see it. The fence is good work. 4-strand tight cedar corners, and the signs are the metal kind that'll outlast me. I walked the north side of it, maybe a quarter mile, with my hands in my pockets. about 2 feet outside the wire, running along it. There's a deer trail worn down to bare dirt, deep as a footpath. They've been walking it long enough to cut it in. They come right up along the fence, the whole length of it, and they don't cross.